The frost settles first on the iron of the gates, and then much later on the edges of the freshly turned earth. It is a quiet, creeping white that silences the leaning stones of the parish ground. You stand deep in the shadow of the perimeter wall, wrapped in layers of heavy, damp wool that smell of old rain, wet clay, and coal smoke. The air is entirely still, holding the freeze close to the ground. There is only the biting cold against your face and the rough, stiff bite of hemp rope coiled tight across your bare palm. You shift your weight in the dark. The frost crunches, barely a whisper beneath the worn leather of your boots. You hold your breath, listening for the watchman's heavy tread. But there is only the distant, muffled barking of a dog miles away, swallowed quickly by the fog. To the sleeping houses just beyond the graveyard wall, this is simply the dead of night. The families rest behind locked doors and drawn curtains, trusting the weight of the soil to keep its promises. The graves were closed for the living's peace, but in these quiet hours they are opened for the surgeon's table. At your feet lies the plain equipment of a silent, unlit trade. A canvas sack, its seams reinforced, currently flat and stiffened by the freezing air. A wooden spade with a short handle, worn perfectly smooth, oiled by the sweat of a dozen starless nights. And the dark lantern. Its tin shutter is drawn almost entirely closed, allowing only a single, needle-thin sliver of warm candlelight to strike the heavy, cast-iron links of a nearby mortsafe. That iron cage, bolted deep into the soil, was meant to be impenetrable. It was meant to be a final lock on a long sleep. But locks are only metal, and metal gives way to the right tools, the right silence, and the right hands. This is a world where the weight of the earth is measured in shillings, where the side door of the anatomy school waits for the muffled wheels of a midnight cart. There are no names spoken in this trade. There is only the wet clay, the quiet fear of discovery, and the breath leaving your lungs in white, ragged clouds. What does the dark truly cost when a human shape becomes nothing more than stock in trade? When the most sacred, quiet corners of the city become places of desperate, heavy labor? The night holds its breath. The iron waits.
Welcome in. The doors are locked. The day is entirely done, its demands and its noise neatly folded away. There is nothing left for you to solve tonight, nothing left to carry, and nothing left to fix. You can simply let your shoulders settle into the quiet of the room, letting the heavy hours of the afternoon drift away. You are safe here. You have found history for sleepyheads. If you find yourself returning to this quiet harbor week after week, leaving a gentle like on this video is a simple way to help us keep the lanterns lit without ever interrupting your rest. Tonight's quiet history is the dark reality of Victorian body snatchers. We are not stepping into a true crime thriller this evening. We are not tracing the frantic biographies of famous villains or hunting for the sudden shock of a horror novel plot. Those legendary names, the ones that became ghost stories used to frighten children in the streets, are not our guides. Instead, we are looking for the quiet, heavy reality of a forgotten labor. The path we will walk tonight is a careful composite. It is drawn from the dust of parish vaults, the faded ink of sessional long papers, the meticulous cold ledgers of anatomy surgeons, and the worn, scattered notes of city sextons. It is not the story of one novel orphan or a single notorious crew. This is the shape of many nights lived by many nameless hands, drawn together into one continuous, quiet shift in the freezing dark. As you close your eyes and listen, allow yourself to drift. We will open the heavy doors of the early evening, standing with you in the quiet hour before the yard. We will walk the worn paths that sold so many into this silent trade. We will learn the cold geometry of iron, earth, and the closed ground, and wait patiently with the simple, quiet tools of the work. We will carry the slow rhythm of the watch and the street, and listen to the damp clay when the ground fights back. We will find the unlit side door of the anatomy school, stand beside other quiet hands in the dark, and eventually find 3 small mercies before the morning breaks. Finally, we will rest. The grand speeches of politicians, the sweeping historical reforms, and the distant passage of the Anatomy Act will remain exactly that, distant rumors on the horizon, far away from the quiet physical work of the night. Tonight is only about the earth, the breath, and the cold. Breathe in slowly. Let the tension leave your jaw and your hands. The room is safe, the watch has not passed, and when the next voice settles, you are already awake in the hour before the yard.
The cold wakes you long before the watchman calls the hour. It is a heavy, damp chill that settles deep into the marrow of your bones, slipping effortlessly through the warped wooden frame of the single window and pressing down against the thin, coarse wool of your blanket. The house itself seems to be shivering. You can hear the ancient, settling timbers of the roof groaning softly under the immense weight of the winter frost. The walls of the garret are coated in a thin, weeping layer of condensation that turns to ice before it can even reach the rotting skirting boards. The fire in the small iron grate across the room died hours ago, leaving behind only the bitter, sharp scent of old ash and soot. You lie perfectly still in the pitch black, your eyes open, staring up at a ceiling that is too close and entirely unseen. With every slow exhale, your breath rises in a pale, ragged cloud that hangs in the freezing air before slowly dissolving into the dark. The mattress beneath you is incredibly thin, a rough linen sack stuffed with cheap, broken straw. It is a harsh bed, and the sharp ends of the dried stalks prick fiercely through the worn ticking. The straw smells faintly of rotting summer fields and deep, stale dust, a scent that clings to your skin long after you have risen. You do not move immediately. You let the absolute stillness of the room hold you, listening to the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the other sleepers. In the opposite corner, a heavy shape shifts under a pile of dark, ragged coats. It is one of the other men. He lets out a low, rattling breath that catches deep in his chest, holding for a terrifying second before releasing, then settles back into the heavy, unmoving exhaustion of his sleep. You do not know his real name, and he does not know yours. Names are a liability in this cramped garret room, a sharp edge that can snag and tear when the parish constables start asking their questions. You are simply hands in the dark, bound together by the quiet, heavy labor of the coming shift. You finally throw back the blanket, and the sudden shock of the freezing air hits your shoulders like a physical weight. Your joints ache with a dull, persistent throb, a quiet reminder of the wet clay and the heavy lifting of the nights before. You swing your legs over the edge of the low bed, your bare feet meeting the freezing, uneven planks of the wooden floorboards. There is no candle lit. There is no morning greeting. The work demands absolute silence from the moment your feet touch the floor. You dress entirely by touch, your hands moving with a slow, practiced memory. You pull on a shirt of thick, undyed cotton.
The fabric is brutally stiff, frozen by the ambient air and crusted with the dried sweat of previous nights. Over this goes a heavy woolen waistcoat, missing half its buttons, and thick, rough trousers that smell permanently of turned earth, damp leaves, and river fog. There is a specific, heavy rhythm to preparing for the yard. You cannot wear anything that catches the light, and you cannot wear anything that makes a sound. No loose metal, no jingling coins in a pocket, no bright scarves. You are dressing to become a shadow, to blend seamlessly into the brick walls and the overgrown yew trees of the parish grounds. You reach for your boots. They are heavy, blunt things, made of thick, unpolished leather that has been scored and scratched by 1,000 hidden stones. The soles are thick, but the leather of the toes is permanently hardened by the cold, wet mud of the grave shafts. You pull them on, tying the thick leather laces with slow, deliberate pulls, securing them tightly against your ankles. They are the boots of a laborer, but tonight they must step as quietly as a phantom across the frosted grass. In the farthest, darkest corner of the room, leaning against the damp plaster wall, lie the tools of your quiet trade. You move toward them, your hands reaching out in the blackness to take inventory. First, you touch the spade. It is not the long-handled, iron-bladed shovel of a common ditch digger. The handle is cut short, barely 2 feet long, designed to be swung in the impossibly tight, narrow confines of a deep vertical shaft. The blade is made entirely of dense, hardened wood, not iron. Iron clangs against hidden stones. Iron rings out against the buried brickwork of a vault. Wood only yields a dull, muffled thud, a sound easily swallowed by the dense city fog. The handle is perfectly smooth, polished to a dull shine by the friction of a dozen starless nights and the rough calluses of your own bare palms. Beside the spade lies the canvas sack. You pick it up, feeling the immense, stiff weight of the fabric. It is folded flat now, but the seams have been heavily reinforced with thick, doubled twine, built to hold a terrible, shifting weight. The canvas is coarse and smells deeply of the earth, a scent that never truly washes out, no matter how many times it is scrubbed in the yard. You fold it over your arm, letting its heavy bulk rest against your side.
Next is the rope. It is a long, heavy coil of braided hemp, thick enough to burn the skin of your palms if it slips, but strong enough to haul a tremendous burden up from the dark. You test the knot at the end, running your thumb over the rough, frayed fibers, ensuring it is secure. Finally, you reach for the dark lantern. It is a simple, cylindrical thing made of cold, cheap tin. It smells intensely of whale oil and burnt wick. Your fingers find the sliding metal shutter that wraps around the glass lens. You push it slightly, feeling the smooth glide of the metal, making sure it can be snapped entirely closed in a fraction of a second. This lantern will not light your way through the streets. It will remain cold and dark until you are deep within the absolute blackness of the earth. And even then, it will only be allowed to cast a single needle-thin sliver of warm light to guide the edge of the spade. You gather the tools, their familiar weight settling into your hands and across your shoulders. You step toward the heavy wooden door of the garret, turning the iron latch with agonizing slowness to prevent a single click of the metal mechanism. You slip out into the narrow hallway, pulling the door shut behind you until it meets the frame with a soft, muffled thud. The boarding house is entirely still. As you creep down the narrow, twisting staircase, your descent is a calculated, tense choreography. You place your boots carefully on the extreme edges of the wooden treads, pressed right against the wall where the boards are nailed tightest and least likely to groan. You pass the closed doors of the other lodgers. Behind these thin wooden barriers, the honest laborers, the tired clerks, and the sleeping families are resting deeply. They trust the night, they trust the heavy iron locks on the parish gates, and they trust the quiet sanctity of the soil. The graves were closed for the living's peace. They were meant to be a final, undisturbed quiet. But you know the truth of the city's hidden economy. You know that while the city sleeps, those same graves are opened for the surgeon's table. You reach the bottom of the stairs and slip out the back door, stepping over the threshold and into the narrow, winding alleyway. The freezing air hits your lungs instantly, sharp and clean compared to the stagnant air of the house. A thick, pewtery fog has rolled in off the river, swallowing the tops of the brick chimneys and muting the distant, scattered lights of the city. The moon is completely hidden behind a dense, heavy layer of cloud. It is the perfect weather for the trade. You walk silently down the alleyway, the cobblestones slick with a thin layer of wet frost. You navigate the dark by memory, turning down a narrow passage that smells of damp brick and old rain. At the end of the passage, tucked away in a small hidden yard behind a shuttered tavern, you find the cart.
It is a small, unadorned thing, barely more than a wooden box set upon a single axle. The horse, hitched to the front, stands with its head bowed low, its breath pluming in thick, white clouds from its nostrils. It does not whinny or stamp its hooves. It is a tired, broken-down animal, accustomed to the freezing, motionless waits in the dark alleys of the city. Before the cart can be moved, the wheels must be prepared. This is a cold, agonizing ritual. You kneel in the freezing mud beside the cart, pulling long strips of discarded wool and heavy sackcloth from a wooden bucket. The rags are damp, foul-smelling, and completely freezing to the touch. You begin to weave the thick cloth tightly through the heavy wooden spokes, pulling it taut over the iron rims. You bind the padding with coarse twine, knotting it with numb fingers, pressing the fabric down until the metal is entirely cushioned. The freezing water squeezes out of the rags, running down your wrists and soaking into the cuffs of your shirt. It takes many minutes of silent, back-breaking work, but when it is done, the wheels are utterly transformed. When this cart moves, it makes almost no sound at all. It simply glides over the jagged stones like a ghost ship over dark water. You lay the wooden spade, the coiled rope, and the dark lantern into the bed of the cart, covering them carefully with a stiff, frosted tarpaulin. The other men have arrived silently from the shadows, taking their places beside the wheels. No words are spoken. A single quiet nod is exchanged in the dark. The driver clicks his tongue, a sound barely louder than a dripping pipe, and the horse leans forward into the harness. The cart begins to move, rolling out of the yard and into the labyrinth of the sleeping city. You walk slowly beside the muffled wheels, your boots stepping in perfect time with the slow, heavy rhythm of the horse. You pass rows of terraced houses, their windows blind and dark. You pass the heavy, locked shops and the quiet, empty squares. You are a moving shadow, a part of the city's invisible, nocturnal machinery, drifting inexorably toward the high brick walls of the parish grounds.
The night air presses against your face. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the sleeping house pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.
The fog rolling off the unseen river carries the bitter taste of coal smoke and low tide. It clings to the heavy wool of your coat, settling as a fine wet mist against your eyelashes as you walk steadily beside the muffled cart. You keep your hands driven deep into your pockets. In the right pocket, your rough fingertips trace the worn, smooth edge of a single copper coin. It is a pitifully thin disk of metal, barely enough to buy a heel of stale bread or a shallow measure of watered gin. Yet it is the entire sum of your worldly wealth. It is the cold, hard weight of the trap that led you to this silent procession in the dark. No one is born into the resurrection trade. No child looks toward the high brick walls of the parish grounds and dreams of the wooden spade or the heavy canvas sack. The men who walk beside you tonight, the shadowed figures with their collars turned up against the frieze, did not choose this labor out of malice or some innate cruelty. You did not choose it either. You were sold into it by the slow, crushing geometry of the city's poverty. It began, as it always does for the laborers of the dark, with a hard winter. The frost came early, locking the city in a tight, breathless grip. The river froze near the docks, the thick gray ice trapping the timber ships and the coal barges at their moorings. When the river stops, the heavy lifting of the day stops with it. The warehouses shuttered their doors. The foremen turned their backs. For a man who survives entirely by the strength of his shoulders and the sweat of his brow, a frozen river is a slow, silent death sentence. You remember the creeping, absolute terror of those idle days. The fire in the grate shrinking to a handful of glowing embers, the agonizingly slow realization that the rent was due, and the landlord's heavy, impatient boots were already pacing the floorboards of the hallway below. The choice laid before you was not a grand moral crossroads. It was a simple, brutal mathematics. On one side stood the union workhouse. It meant the stripping of your remaining dignity, the forced separation from anyone you held dear, and the trading of your own worn clothes for the coarse gray uniform of a parish pauper. It meant breaking stones in a freezing courtyard until your spirit was entirely crushed into the dust. And on the other side was the night. The transaction that brought you into this crew did not happen in a bright office or a gentleman's parlor. It happened in the suffocating, smoke-stained back room of a quiet tavern tucked away in the sprawling labyrinth of St. Giles. You remember the smell of that room, a dense, sour mixture of spilled ale, wet sawdust, and cheap pipe tobacco. You sat at a scarred wooden table across from a man whose heavy knuckles were permanently stained with dark, yellow clay. He did not ask for your references. He did not ask for your trade. He only looked at the width of your shoulders, the thick calluses on your palms, and the hollow, desperate hunger in your eyes.
He slid a small glass of gin across the scratched wood. You took it. That was the contract. In that dimly lit room, your identity was stripped away just as thoroughly as it would have been in the workhouse, only here it was done with silence. In this trade, a name is a dangerous, heavy thing to carry.
If the watchman's lantern suddenly catches you in the yard, or if a parish constable kicks in the door of the boarding house, a name is the first thing they will beat out of you. So your name thins out. It dissolves in the stale tavern air. To the master of the crew, you became simply the boy. To the others pulling the cart, you are the hands. You are a back to carry the weight. You are a pair of boots in the frost. You are nothing more than a quiet shadow standing at the edge of the pit. And the terrible irony of this shadow life is that it is entirely funded by the brightest, most respected minds of the city. The anatomy schools of the capital are hungry. They are vast, echoing theaters of science, filled with rows of steep wooden benches and young, ambitious gentlemen holding clean, silver scalpels. They study the intricate architecture of the human form, charting the courses of veins and the hidden mechanics of muscle and bone. They are learning to heal the living, but the law, in its rigid morality, only provides them with the bodies of executed murderers from the gallows. A handful of subjects a year for hundreds of students, it is simply not enough. The math fails. The graves were closed for the living's peace, heavily guarded by tradition and iron. Yet the insatiable demand of the surgeon's table requires them to be opened. The surgeons do not ask where the subjects come from. They do not want to know about the frozen mud of the churchyard or the desperate men shivering in the dark. The gentlemen of science keep their hands perfectly clean. They operate through intermediaries, through quiet knocks on the anatomy school's unlit back door. They maintain ledgers filled with neat black ink, recording the transactions with a cold, detached precision. In those heavy leather books, there are no names of the dead. There is only inventory. A large subject for a handful of shining guineas, a small subject, a child, for a few crowns. It is a brutal, invisible economy, where a human form, once deeply loved and carefully laid to rest, is reduced to a commodity. It becomes a parcel, a weight to be lifted, transported, and sold before the morning light can reveal the theft. You think of the ink in those ledgers as you walk. You think of the wealthy students sitting in their warm, brightly lit lecture halls, completely insulated from the freezing fog that bites at your jaw. They rely on your hunger. They depend on the frozen river and the crushing threat of the workhouse to keep their tables full. The entire progression of medical science in this glittering modern century rests squarely on the tired, aching shoulders of nameless men dragging canvas sacks through the mud.
The cart suddenly stops. The muffled wheels halt their soft, rhythmic glide over the cobblestones. The horse lowers its head, exhaling a thick plume of steam into the icy air. You look up. Emerging from the impenetrable gloom of the fog, rising like a sheer cliff face against the starless sky, is the high brick wall of the parish burial ground. The journey through the streets is over. The quiet, desperate bargains made in the tavern are sealed. There is no turning back now, no warm fire to return to, and no escaping the heavy work that waits on the other side of the brick. You step away from the cart, your hands leaving the warmth of your pockets to grasp the smooth, frozen wood of the short-handled spade. The other men move silently to their positions. The dark lantern remains completely shuttered. You approach the wall, placing your rough hands against the damp, freezing brick. You can smell the wet earth waiting just on the other side. You can feel the immense, silent weight of the sleeping city pressing down around you. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the parish pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling. The rough, flaking surface of the perimeter wall is slick with a thin glaze of freezing condensation. You press your bare palms against the freezing brick, feeling the sharp edges of the old mortar biting into your calluses. The wall is easily 8 feet high, built to keep the living out and to hold the dead in. But a wall is only a true barrier if there is someone awake to watch it. You do not climb wildly. You move with a slow, agonizingly measured caution. One of the other men steps close, interlacing his thick fingers to form a stirrup. You place the toe of your stiff leather boot in his hands, and with a silent, synchronized heave, you are lifted upward. You reach the flat ridge of the wall. In many of the wealthier city parishes, this top edge is embedded with jagged shards of broken glass or sharp, rusted iron spikes set into the mortar specifically to tear the flesh and clothing of the night crews. But you are prepared for the geometry of this defense. From beneath your heavy woolen coat, you pull a thick folded square of dense leather, scarred and stiff from years of use. You drape it carefully over the sharp iron teeth capping the brickwork. It forms a safe, padded bridge. You pull yourself up, your chest pressing against the cold leather, and swing your legs over the terrible edge. For one breathless second, you balance on the narrow precipice between the sleeping street and the silent yard. Then you drop. You land squarely in the wet, frosted grass on the other side, your knees bending deeply to absorb the shock. Your heavy boots make almost no sound against the soft earth. You remain crouched in the absolute dark, frozen in place, listening. Your heart beats a slow, heavy rhythm against your ribs. You wait for a shout from the shadows, or the sudden blinding flash of a watchman's bull's-eye lantern sweeping across the leaning headstones. But there is nothing. The yard is perfectly still. The leather pad is pulled down by a shadow above, and one by one the other men drop silently to the grass beside you. The air on this side of the wall is entirely different. It is noticeably heavier, trapped within the basin of the high brick enclosure, sheltered from the faint breeze that moves down the alleys. It smells deeply of decaying yew branches, wet stone, and the dense, unmistakable odor of turned London clay. You let your eyes adjust to the starless dark, allowing the faint, ambient glow of the distant city, a mutted, pewtery haze hanging in the fog, to sketch the outlines of the yard.
This is the silent architecture of the closed ground. It is a sprawling, chaotic garden of leaning slate, heavy granite tombs, and sunken depressions hidden in the overgrown weeds. To an ordinary man walking through the gates in the daylight, it is a place of final rest and quiet reflection. To you, standing in the freezing dark, it is a map of obstacles and opportunities. You must read the ground not by the names carved in stone, but by the subtle, hidden language of the soil. You move forward, stepping carefully between the graves, your boots tracing a path you cannot fully see. You are not looking for the old, settled ground. You are looking for the fresh mound. The sexton, the man who digs the graves by day, often tries to disguise his newest work. He might scatter dry leaves over the wet clay, or replace the sod in a neat, unbroken patchwork to make the earth look undisturbed. But the ground cannot truly keep a secret from those who know how to walk upon it. When your boot steps on a grave that has been dug and filled within the last 2 weeks, the earth feels soft. It yields slightly under your weight, lacking the hard, compacted density of a grave that has endured years of winter rain. You pause, your foot sinking just a fraction of an inch into a stretch of bare, dark earth.
You kneel, pulling the thick wool of your glove away with your teeth, and press your bare hand directly against the soil. It is wet, it is loose, and it is entirely freezing. As your fingers trace the edge of the mound, they brush against something hard buried just beneath the surface of the frost. It is not stone, it is not root, it is iron. You draw back slightly, motioning in the dark to the man carrying the unlit lantern. He steps close, kneeling beside you. With his thumb, he eases the tin shutter open just a fraction of a millimeter. A single, impossibly thin beam of yellow light escapes, striking the ground between your hands. There, bolted deep into the clay, sits a massive cage of thick wrought iron. It is a mortsafe. It is a terrible, heavy thing, built of iron bars as thick as a man's wrist, welded together into a sprawling grid that covers the entire length and width of the grave beneath. You lean closer, needing to read the obstacle with your own hands. You press your bare fingertips against the massive, intricate padlock that binds the main crossbars. It is a formidable piece of engineering, heavy as a cannonball, currently slick with a rime of freezing dew.
The cold of the iron is absolute. It bites immediately into your flesh, a sharp, burning ache that travels straight up your arm. You trace the rusted edges of the keyhole. Flakes of wet oxidation cling to your calluses, smelling sharply of old blood and deep earth. You grip one of the thick links of the heavy chain and pull, just a fraction of an inch, testing the tension. It yields absolutely nothing. A minute, microscopic shift of the metal produces a dull clink that sounds terrifyingly loud in the dead silence of the yard. You freeze, holding your breath, waiting to see if the sound carries over the perimeter wall. It does not. But the message of the cage is clear. The iron is anchored deep into blocks of solid granite, stones so massive they would require a team of draft horses to move in the daylight. This cage cannot be picked. It cannot be quietly unraveled. The mortsafe is a monument to a desperate, paralyzing fear. It is the physical weight of a family's grief combined with the terrifying knowledge of the night trade. They paid a blacksmith to forge this heavy, unyielding cage. They paid the parish a vast sum to rent it, locking it over the fresh grave of their loved one to protect them during the first vulnerable weeks when the anatomy schools are most hungry. The graves were closed for the living's peace, and this iron was meant to enforce that peace against the surgeon's demand. You run your hand along the freezing, rusted links one last time. The iron is immovable. It would take heavy sledges, crowbars, and an hour of deafening, metallic violence to break through it. The watchman would be summoned in seconds. The mortsafe has done its job. It has defeated you. But you do not strike the iron. You simply let go. The man beside you snaps the lantern shutter entirely closed, plunging you back into the absolute blackness. You stand, brushing the wet, freezing mud from your knees, and simply take 2 steps to the left. The iron only protects those who can afford its terrible weight. The poorer graves, the simple pine boxes buried in the crowded, unmarked rows just a few feet away, have no cages. They have no granite blocks. They are guarded only by the freezing clay and the silent darkness of the sky.
You find the soft, yielding earth of the unprotected grave. You stand at what you judge to be the head of the shaft. There is a specific geometry to this work, a careful mathematics designed to save time and silence. A common gravedigger opens the entire length of the rectangular shaft, moving massive tons of earth to lower the box flat. But you are not a gravedigger. You are a shadow, operating on a rapidly shrinking clock. You will not open the entire grave. You will only dig a small, tight square, roughly 3 feet across, directly over the head and shoulders of the coffin below. It is a vertical tunnel, dropping straight down into the absolute dark. The man with the short-handled wooden spade steps forward. He does not swing it like a farmer tilling a field. He presses the smooth wooden blade into the wet clay with a steady, rocking motion, using the weight of his body to drive it down without a single scrape or sound. He lifts a heavy square block of the wet, blue-gray earth and sets it silently onto the canvas tarpaulin laid out on the grass beside the grave. The work begins. It is agonizing, heavy labor. The clay is dense and sticky, clinging to the wood, fighting every movement of your shoulders. You take turns in the freezing dark, trading the spade when your arms begin to tremble, standing on the edge of the expanding hole and looking down. With every foot of depth, the darkness inside the square shaft becomes absolute. It is a suffocating, heavy dark. The smell of the raw earth fills your lungs, damp and ancient. You are standing on the threshold of the closed ground, breaking the seal of the soil, entirely isolated from the warm, brightly lit houses of the sleeping city. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the parish pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.
The dampness of the raw clay has completely soaked through the rough wool at the knees of your trousers. You are kneeling at the edge of the narrow 3-foot square shaft, your chest heaving with the slow, burning exertion of the dig. Below you, the tunnel drops down into an absolute, suffocating blackness. The air rising from the hole is distinctly different from the freezing fog above. It is ancient, completely stagnant, and carries the heavy metallic scent of deep earth and buried stones. You trade places with the man in the shaft. It is your turn to descend. You slide down into the tight vertical space, your heavy boots bracing against the sheer walls of wet, blue-gray mud to control your fall. The space is impossibly narrow. It presses in against your shoulders, a physical, claustrophobic weight that surrounds you on all 4 sides. The freezing wind of the churchyard cannot reach you down here, but the cold of the deep earth is entirely different. It is a still, heavy cold that seems to radiate directly from the clay, settling into the marrow of your bones and stiffening the joints of your fingers. You reach up, and the short-handled wooden spade is passed down to you in the dark. You do not need light to know this tool. Your hands possess a perfect blind memory of its shape. The wood is dense and heavy, the handle worn entirely smooth by the friction of countless shifts. You press the flat edge of the wooden blade into the floor of the shaft. You cannot use the powerful, sweeping motions of a day laborer. There is no room to swing. Instead, you drive the spade downward using only the concentrated weight of your shoulders and the slow, agonizing press of your boots. The wet clay yields with a thick, muffled, severing sound. You pry a heavy square block of the earth loose, balancing it carefully on the flat of the wooden blade. You lift it upward. The man waiting at the top of the shaft takes the heavy weight from your spade in absolute silence. He does not throw the dirt onto the frost-covered grass. To do so would leave a permanent, glaring scar on the landscape, an undeniable sign of the night's work that the sexton would discover at first light.
Instead, every single ounce of the wet clay is placed meticulously onto the large canvas tarpaulin laid out beside the grave. This tarpaulin is the silent ledger of the trade. It catches every crumb of loose soil, every stray pebble, and every broken root. When the work is done, the men will simply lift the corners of the heavy canvas, pouring the earth directly back into the vertical shaft, leaving the surrounding grass entirely untouched. It is a slow, methodical erasure of your own presence. You continue to dig. The rhythm of the work takes over. The press of the spade, the heavy lift, the quiet exchange in the dark.
Your muscles burn with a deep, persistent ache, but you do not stop. You cannot stop. The watchman's heavy iron bell will eventually chime the passing of the hour, and the protective cover of the deep night is constantly bleeding away. Suddenly, the wooden blade of your spade strikes something hard. It does not ring out with the sharp, dangerous clang of metal on stone. It yields a hollow, dense thud, wood against wood. You have reached the lid of the coffin. You freeze. The air in your lungs catches, holding perfectly still. You look up toward the faint gray square of the night sky framed by the opening of the shaft above. You listen. You wait for the sound of boots on the gravel path or the frantic barking of a dog alerted by the hollow sound. There is nothing. The yard remains entirely silent, swallowed by the freezing fog. You drop to your knees in the confined space of the pit, using your bare hands to scrape away the last few inches of the wet clay, clearing a small space directly over the head of the wooden box. Now a new tool is required. From the deep pocket of your heavy coat, you draw a small iron crowbar. It is barely a foot long, its metal surface heavily wrapped in tightly wound leather strips to muffle any accidental strike against the stones. The flat, hooked end is left bare. There is no room in this narrow tunnel to open the entire coffin. The long horizontal box stretches out into the solid earth beyond the walls of your vertical shaft. You must work only with the upper third. You wedge the iron edge of the crowbar into the thin seam between the coffin lid and its side. You do not pry wildly. You apply a slow, agonizingly steady pressure. The wooden lid, already weakened by the dampness of the deep earth and the immense pressing weight of the clay above it, begins to groan. It is a terrible straining sound, like the ice of a frozen pond beginning to crack underfoot. You press harder. The iron bites into the pine. With a sudden sharp crack that seems deafening in the silence of the hole, the top third of the wooden lid snaps. It gives way, folding upward under the immense pressure of your lever. The seal is broken. The graves were closed for the living's peace, securely nailed and buried beneath 6 feet of heavy London clay, yet they are opened with nothing more than a wooden spade and a foot of iron for the surgeon's table. You reach into the absolute blackness beneath the broken wood. You do not think about what you are touching. You separate your mind entirely from your hands. You are not touching a name or a history or a quiet tragedy. You are touching a weight. You are touching a burden that must be moved.
From the top of the shaft, the heavy coil of hemp rope is lowered down to you. The rope is stiff with the freezing cold, its rough braided fibers biting into the calluses of your palms. It is thick, strong enough to haul a tremendous, shifting weight straight up the narrow vertical tunnel. You work entirely by touch, sliding the heavy hemp beneath the arms of the shape in the dark. You tie the knot with a slow, deliberate precision. If the knot slips halfway up the shaft, the sudden crashing fall will echo across the entire yard, bringing the watchman running with his heavy wooden truncheon and his lantern.
You test the tension, pulling sharply against the hemp. It holds. You whisper a single sharp hiss through your teeth. It is the only signal allowed. Above you, the men take hold of the rope. You press yourself flat against the wet, freezing clay wall of the shaft to make room. The thick hemp goes taut. It groans against the edge of the broken coffin lid. Then the slow, agonizing lift begins. It is an incredibly heavy, cumbersome extraction. The burden does not move easily. It catches against the rough edges of the broken wood, dragging heavily against the narrow clay walls of the tunnel. You use your hands to guide it upward, pushing from below as the men above strain against the rope. The friction of the canvas shroud against the mud creates a soft, continuous tearing sound. Finally, the weight clears the top of the shaft. You are left alone in the dark, breathing heavily, the smell of the opened earth overwhelming in the confined space. You grip the edge of the tunnel and pull yourself up, emerging back into the freezing fog of the yard. The burden has already been laid out on the frost-covered grass. One of the men is unfolding the heavy canvas sack. It is a large, featureless bag, its reinforced seams stiff and unyielding in the cold. It smells of damp corners, old twine, and the stale dust of 100 previous nights. They do not fold the canvas gently. They work with a desperate, frantic efficiency, sliding the heavy fabric over the shape, pulling the thick drawstrings tight, and sealing it away from the night air. What was once a solemn, protected resting place has now been reduced to a simple, unlit parcel. You retrieve the wooden spade from the dirt. The men grab the corners of the heavy tarpaulin, and in one synchronized movement, they tip the immense pile of wet clay back into the vertical shaft. The earth falls with a muffled, heavy rushing sound, swallowing the broken wood and the empty space below. You use the flat of your heavy boots to stamp the soil down, packing it tightly into the frost. You work the loose leaves and the broken grass back over the scar, hiding the violence of the tools beneath the quiet illusion of the unbroken ground. Out in the hidden alleyway, beyond the high brick wall, the cart waits. Its wheels are heavily wrapped in rags, perfectly muffled, ready to carry the canvas sack through the sleeping, starless city. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the sleeping house pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.
The rough, fibrous texture of the heavy canvas sack scrapes softly against the splintered wooden edge of the cart bed. It is a dull, heavy sound, quickly swallowed by the thick, insulating curtain of the freezing fog. You and the other men push the burden inward, sliding it flat against the floorboards. The cart dips slightly on its single iron axle, accepting the terrible, dense weight of the night's work. You pull the stiff, frosted tarpaulin over the sack, smoothing the heavy canvas down so that it appears to be nothing more than a mound of discarded market goods or unsorted rags. The man holding the reins gives a low, nearly imperceptible click of his tongue. The horse, a dark, heavy shadow in the mist, leans forward into its leather harness. The cart begins to roll. There is a distinct, mesmerizing rhythm to moving through the sleeping city. The massive wooden wheels, their iron rims meticulously wrapped in layer upon layer of tight, dirty rags, do not clatter against the uneven cobblestones. Instead, they produce a soft, continuous, rhythmic compression. It is a slow, wet, tearing sound, like a heavy boot pulling away from thick mud, repeating endlessly in the dark. Hush, hush, hush. You walk beside the cart, keeping your pace perfectly matched to the slow, heavy step of the horse. Your right hand rests lightly on the cold, damp wood of the side panel, using the physical connection to guide you through the impenetrable gray gloom. The city at this hour is a completely different landscape than the one known to honest laborers by day. The wide, bustling thoroughfares are avoided entirely. You navigate a complex, invisible map of narrow alleyways, twisting service passages, and deep, shadowed lanes that run behind the tall, silent rows of brick houses. The air in these narrow channels is stagnant and freezing, smelling strongly of wet soot, old rain, and the faint, sour odor of the nearby river. The fog hangs so thickly between the buildings that you can barely see the horse's head just a few feet in front of you. The silence of the journey is absolute, but it is not empty. It is a heavy, pressurized silence, filled with the constant, exhausting effort of remaining unseen. Every doorway is a potential threat. Every shadowed corner could hide the parish watch. Suddenly, the driver pulls back sharply on the leather reins. The horse stops instantly, freezing in place without a single stamp of its hooves. The driver raises one bare hand in the gloom. You stop. You hold your breath, letting the white cloud of your exhale dissipate slowly through your nose. You press your back completely flat against the freezing damp brick of the alley wall. The cold of the stone bleeds immediately through the thick wool of your coat, chilling your spine, but you do not dare to shiver.
You listen. At first, there is only the distant, hollow dripping of water from a broken rain gutter overhead. Then, beneath the drip, you hear it. It is a slow, methodical, heavy tread, the measured strike of thick, iron-shod boots against stone. Clack, pause, clack, pause. It is the parish watchman. He is moving down the cross street directly ahead of your narrow alley. He is not running. He is not searching frantically. He is simply walking his assigned beat, a solitary figure tasked with keeping the immense, sprawling dark of the city at bay. As the footsteps draw closer, a pale, sickly yellow light begins to bleed through the fog at the end of the passage. It is the beam of his bullseye lantern, swinging in a slow, rhythmic arc across the slick cobblestones. The light catches the swirling mist, illuminating millions of tiny, freezing water droplets hanging suspended in the air. You close your eyes, trusting the absolute stillness of your own body. The physical toll of the silence is agonizing. You have drawn a half-breath and locked it tight in your chest, terrified that the sudden white plume of a full exhale in the freezing air will catch the lantern's beam like smoke from a signal fire. Your lungs begin to burn with a dull, rising heat. The muscles in your jaw ache from being clamped entirely shut. You press the back of your head so hard against the damp brick that the cold stone numbs your scalp. Through your closed eyelids, you can sense the shift in the gloom. The pale yellow light of the lantern is bleeding directly across the mouth of the alley. If the watchman turns his head, if he simply rotates his wrist and points that narrow, focused beam down this specific passage, the heavy cart, the horse, and the men standing like statues in the shadows will be instantly revealed. You watch the edge of the light scrape across the wet brickwork just 10 feet away. It illuminates a rusted iron ring set into the wall, a patch of green moss, a shattered cobblestone. It is a slow, agonizing sweep. The penalty for what lies beneath the tarpaulin is severe. It means the heavy iron doors of Newgate Prison, the cold chains, the forced labor of the treadmill, and the absolute ruin of what little life you have left. But there is a hidden economy to the night, a quiet truth that governs these freezing streets. The families sleeping securely in the tall houses around you trust implicitly in the heavy tread of those boots. They pay their parish taxes to maintain the watch, believing that the graves were closed for the living's peace, and that this lone man with his lantern will guard that peace against the dark.
What they do not know is that the surgeon's wealth is far heavier than the parish coin. Often, a few silver shillings have already changed hands hours before, slipped quietly across a stained tavern table. A silent agreement has been made. The watchman will walk his beat precisely on time, his lantern shining brightly, but his eyes will remain fixed straight ahead. He will not look down the narrow alleys. He will not investigate the soft, muffled sound of wrapped wheels. He will sell the street's safety to the highest bidder, allowing the dark demand of the anatomy schools to pass completely unhindered. The heavy footsteps reach the mouth of the alley. The yellow beam of the lantern sweeps across the wet cobblestones just 10 feet away from the horse's nose. The light does not turn inward. Clack. Pause. Clack. The sound begins to fade. The pale light dissolves back into the deep, pewtery gray of the fog. The watchman continues down the cross street, his duty fulfilled, his pockets slightly heavier. You let out a long, slow breath, the tension leaving your shoulders in a rush of exhaustion. The driver clicks his tongue, and the cart begins to glide forward once more. You turn the corner, leaving the watchman far behind, only to face a new, unpredictable danger. As the cart rolls past a high wooden fence enclosing a small private courtyard, the silence is broken by a low, vibrating growl. It comes from just on the other side of the wet, rotting boards. It is a large dog, awake and alert. It cannot see the cart, but it does not need to. The animal can smell the raw, ancient earth clinging to your boots. It can smell the damp canvas, and it can smell the terrible, heavy reality of what is hidden beneath the tarpaulin. The cart stops again. You freeze in the center of the street. The growl deepens, rising in the dog's throat. You can hear the heavy, wet sniffing of the animal as it paces back and forth along the bottom of the fence, its claws scratching frantically against the buried wood. The animal is completely blind to you, but its instincts are locked on to the raw scent of the open ground. A single bark will shatter the quiet of the street. It will echo off the narrow brick walls, multiplying in the fog, bringing the neighbors to their windows with candles in hand.
One of the men steps slowly toward the fence. He does not raise his hands. He does not make a sudden move. He reaches deep into the pocket of his heavy coat and withdraws a small, hard scrap of dried meat, kept precisely for this moment. He tosses it silently over the top of the wooden boards. It lands with a soft thud in the wet grass of the courtyard. The low growl cuts off instantly. There is a frantic snuffling sound, the wet nose of the dog investigating the sudden offering in the dark. Then there is only the quiet sound of chewing. The animal's instinct to raise the alarm has been momentarily replaced by the desperate hunger of the cold night. The danger passes as quickly as it arrived. The cart rolls on. The physical toll of the night is beginning to set in. Your hands, gripping the side of the cart, are entirely numb. The damp cold has seeped through every layer of your clothing, settling heavily in your chest. You lower your head against the freezing mist, putting one heavy boot in front of the other, focused entirely on the hypnotic, rhythmic rotation of the muffled wheels beside you. Far in the distance, cutting through the endless stretches of black and gray, you see a single, solitary square of light. It is the window of a late-night inn, glowing with a warm, dim orange firelight. Even from blocks away, it looks impossibly inviting. It is a beacon of warmth, of hot spiced ale, of dry wood burning in a wide hearth, and of honest men resting their shoulders. It is a world you are entirely shut out from. You cannot park this heavy, silent cart outside a brightly lit tavern. You cannot step into the warmth with the raw clay still packed into the deep creases of your boots and the smell of the turned earth clinging to your skin. You must remain in the freezing dark, passing the warm window like a ghost. You watch the orange square of light slowly slide past, fading back into the fog behind you, leaving you alone once more with the wet cobblestones and the heavy burden. The journey is nearly over. The narrow streets begin to widen, leading toward the towering shadowed structures of the medical district. The side door of the anatomy school is waiting, completely unlit, hidden in a discreet alleyway where no questions are asked. You lean your weight against the cart, pushing it through the final stretch of the city's maze. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the sleeping house pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.
Not every night ends at the quiet, unlit threshold of the medical district. There is a memory that haunts the dark corners of the taverns, a collective, unspoken terror that rides with every man who takes up the short-handled wooden spade. It is the memory of the nights when the perfect mathematics of the 3-foot shaft simply fail, when the heavy ancient geometry of the churchyard refuses to yield, and the raw earth decides to fight back. It always begins with a shift in the weather. The freezing fog and the hard, bitter frosts are the true allies of the resurrection trade, locking the soil into dense, predictable blocks that can be cut and stacked with silent precision. But when the deep winter breaks for a sudden thaw, or when a week of heavy, relentless rain saturates the city, the London clay changes its nature entirely. It ceases to be a solid landscape. It becomes a heavy, breathing trap. You remember standing in the shadowed perimeter of a low-lying parish ground, your heavy leather boots sinking immediately into the soft, waterlogged turf. The air did not smell crisp or sharp. It smelled of stagnant pools, rotting roots, and wet, dissolving stone. The ambient light of the city was completely swallowed by a thick, oppressive drizzle that coated your heavy wool coat in a layer of freezing moisture, weighing you down before the work had even begun. The target that night was a fresh mound in the poorest corner of the yard, completely unprotected by iron or granite. But as you knelt to trace the edge of the grave, your bare hands did not find the usual firm, packed soil. The earth was a slick, unyielding paste. It clung to your fingers, heavy and cold. When it was your turn to descend into the narrow vertical shaft, the change in the atmosphere was immediate and terrifying. You slid down into the 3-foot square shaft, but your boots did not find purchase on the walls. The sheer faces of the wet clay, usually rigid and reliable, were slick with seeping groundwater. The space felt impossibly tighter than usual. The heavy, damp air pressed inward against your ribs, thick and suffocating, tasting of old water and deep decay. The short-handled wooden spade was passed down to you in the absolute blackness. You pressed its flat edge into the floor of the tunnel.
Normally, the wood would part the dense clay with a dull, satisfying severance, allowing you to lift a clean, square block. But tonight, The earth did not cut. It simply swallowed the blade. When you tried to pull the spade upward, relying on the strength of your shoulders, the ground fought back. A powerful, terrifying vacuum had formed in the wet mud below, a deep pulling suction that held the wooden tool fast. You strained against it, the muscles in your back screaming in silent protest, your boots sliding desperately against the wet walls as you tried to gain leverage. With a sickening, wet tearing sound, the spade finally tore free, bringing with it an unformed, chaotic mass of heavy, dripping mud. It was exhausting, agonizing labor. Every single lift required twice the effort, the sticky clay fighting your hands, refusing to let go of its own weight. But the true danger of the wet ground was not the exhaustion, it was the terrifying instability of the walls around you. As you dug deeper, sinking further into the lightless vertical passage, you began to hear it. It was not the sharp, distinct sound of a snapping root or a cracking stone. It was a soft, continuous, wet sighing. It was the sound of the earth losing its cohesion. You froze. You stopped breathing entirely, listening in the pitch black. The sheer clay walls pressing against your shoulders were slowly beginning to bow inward. The immense thousands of pounds weight of the saturated ground above and around you was seeking the path of least resistance, looking to fill the empty void of the shaft you had just created. You could feel the pressure changing against your thick wool coat. The space was actively shrinking. You reached the broken wood of the coffin lid, scraping the wet sludge away with frantic, numb fingers. The seal was broken, the heavy rope lowered down and secured. You hissed through your teeth, signaling the men above to begin the lift. The thick hemp went taut, the heavy burden below shifted, and then the ground stopped it. The mud had completely collapsed around the sides of the broken wooden box, creating a tremendous, unyielding suction that locked the weight in place. The men above pulled with all their combined strength, the thick rope groaning and fraying against the edge of the pit, but the burden did not rise a single inch. It was as if the earth itself had firmly grasped the canvas shroud, refusing to surrender what had been placed within its keeping. The graves were closed for the living's peace, and tonight the wet clay was enforcing that peace with absolute, terrifying violence. The sighing sound in the walls grew louder. A heavy clump of wet soil detached from the wall just above your head, striking your shoulder and splashing down into the dark water pooling at your boots.
Panic, sudden and bright, flared in your chest. It is a specific primal terror, the absolute certainty of being buried alive in the freezing dark, trapped beneath tons of wet earth where no one can ever hear you scream, and where your own crew will not dare to dig you out for fear of the watchman's lantern. You abandoned the spade, you abandoned the rope, you reached up blindly, desperately digging your bare, bleeding fingers into the slick, dissolving walls of the tunnel, searching for any possible handhold. You scrambled upward, your boots kicking frantically against the wet mud, fighting the suction that tried to pull you back down into the void. The walls were actively turning to a thick, freezing liquid around you. You felt the hands of the men above grab the heavy collar of your coat, hauling you forcefully out of the mouth of the shaft and throwing you backward onto the wet, frosted grass. You lay on your back in the drizzle, your chest heaving violently, gasping for the cold, sharp air of the yard. A fraction of a second later, the ground finally gave way entirely.
There was a deep, muffled, rushing whoomp that vibrated straight through the soles of your boots. It was the sound of the entire 3-foot vertical shaft collapsing in on itself, millions of pounds of wet, heavy clay crashing down into the void, violently resealing the broken coffin and swallowing the expensive hemp rope entirely. The men stood around the sunken crater in absolute silence. There was no attempt to dig it out. The geometry of the grave had failed, and any further effort would only result in a wider, more catastrophic cave-in, creating an impossible scar on the landscape that would instantly betray their presence to the sexton in the morning. The prize was lost. The immense effort, the agonizing fear, the freezing drizzle, all of it had been for nothing. The night's economy had crashed. There was no time to mourn the lost coin. The silence of the collapsed earth was a temporary mercy. You scrambled to your feet, your hands shaking violently, entirely coated in the thick blue-gray mud. You grabbed the corners of the heavy, empty canvas tarpaulin, folding it away in the dark. The retreat from the yard was not a quiet, measured procession. It was a frantic, desperate escape, slipping and sliding over the overgrown graves, fleeing the heavy, watchful presence of the parish ground. You climbed the high brick wall and dropped back down into the alleyway where the horse and the cart waited exactly as you had left them. The cart remained entirely empty. As you walked beside the muffled wheels through the long, freezing hours back to the boarding house, the damp cold of the clay settled permanently into your chest. Your hands were completely empty. There would be no silver shillings traded in the dark tavern room tonight. There would be no heat in the small iron grate. There would only be the heavy, exhausting realization that you are utterly powerless against the sheer weight of the world, and that the ground will only tolerate your trespassing for so long before it reclaims its own. You pull your collar up against the biting wind coming off the unseen river. You feel the heavy, wet mud drying and cracking across the rough calluses of your palms. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the parish pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.
The uneven, rounded cobblestones of the poorer districts eventually give way to the large, flat paving stones of the wealthy squares. You can feel the transition through the thin, worn leather soles of your heavy boots. The cart rolls more smoothly here, the muffled wheels gliding over the carefully leveled streets with a soft, continuous hiss. The air itself changes. The stagnant, bitter smell of the river and the narrow slums is replaced by the cleaner scent of expensive coal smoke burning in wide marble hearths, and the sharp, freezing wind channeling between tall, unbroken rows of elegant brick houses. You have reached the medical district. This is the geographic center of the city's intellect and progress, a place of grand architecture, wide avenues, and high iron fences. It is a world of bright morning light and brilliant men, but you do not belong to its mornings. You belong entirely to its shadows. The driver guides the horse away from the wide thoroughfares and down a steep, narrow passage that cuts directly behind the grand buildings. This is the Mews, a service alley designed specifically to keep the ugly, necessary labors of the city completely hidden from the polished windows above. The high brick walls on either side close in, plunging the street back into an absolute, suffocating darkness. There are no gas lamps burning here. There are no watchmen walking the beat. The cart slows to a halt behind a towering windowless facade. This is the rear of the anatomy school.
To the public walking the main avenue just one street over, this building is a temple of science. It presents a face of towering Greek columns, heavy oak doors, and a brightly polished brass nameplate gleaming under the streetlights. Tomorrow morning, carriage wheels will clatter against the front curb. Well-dressed young men, the sons of lords and wealthy merchants, will walk confidently up the front steps, carrying their leather-bound notebooks and their clean silver scalpels. They will sit in a brightly lit, steeply tiered lecture theater, eager to map the hidden architecture of the human form. But you are not standing at the grand entrance. You are standing in the freezing, wet alleyway, looking at a single, unmarked wooden door set deep into the heavy stone foundation. This is the threshold of the trade. It is the exact point where the dark, desperate labor of the churchyard intersects with the clean, bright ambition of the surgeon. Above the door, a single wrought iron lamp extends from the brickwork. It is not lit to illuminate the alley. Its glass is heavily smoked, emitting only a faint, dull red glow, a quiet, burning signal to the night crews that the school is hungry, that the tables are empty, and that the house is willing to buy.
You and the other men step toward the cart. The adrenaline that fueled the terrifying extraction in the burial ground has completely faded, leaving behind only a profound, hollow exhaustion. Your muscles tremble slightly in the freezing damp. Your joints ache with a deep, persistent throb. You pull back the stiff, frosted tarpaulin, exposing the heavy canvas sack to the dim red light of the lamp. The burden must be carried one last time. You grip the reinforced seams of the canvas, the rough twine biting into the raw calluses of your palms. With a synchronized, heavy heave, you lift the sack from the bed of the cart. The tremendous weight of it sags between you. It is a dead, shifting weight, awkward and immensely difficult to carry. You shuffle slowly toward the stone steps, your heavy boots scraping softly against the wet pavement. You lower the sack onto the threshold, resting it against the bottom of the unmarked door. The canvas is stained thick with the blue-gray clay of the parish ground. It smells deeply of the damp earth, of crushed yew leaves, and of the freezing fog. It is a piece of the graveyard, ripped from the soil and laid entirely out of place upon the clean, geometric stone of the medical school. The driver steps forward. He raises a gloved hand and raps against the thick wood of the door. He does not knock with the loud, demanding fist of a daytime caller. It is a specific, quiet rhythm. 2 dull thuds, a pause, and a third. It is a knock designed to travel only a few feet through the wood, just enough to reach the man waiting on the other side. You step back, fading into the shadow of the brick wall, pulling the collar of your heavy coat up to hide your face. There is a long, heavy silence. The wind howls softly at the end of the alley. Then you hear the slow, deliberate scrape of a heavy iron deadbolt sliding back. The door opens just a few inches. A sliver of warm, bright yellow light spills out onto the wet stones, cutting through the freezing fog like a knife. With the light comes a sudden, overwhelming wave of air from inside the building. It is incredibly warm, heated by massive basement furnaces, but it smells completely alien to you. It is a sharp chemical sting. It smells of camphor, of strong carbolic acid, of dried herbs, and of clean, burning wax. It is the manufactured scent of preservation and science, clashing violently with the wet, ancient rot of the earth clinging to your clothes. A figure stands in the narrow opening. It is the surgeon's porter, or perhaps a senior student entrusted with the night's commerce. He is dressed in a clean white apron over a fine woolen waistcoat. His hands are scrubbed pink and perfectly clean. He does not step out into the freezing damp. He remains safely inside the warm light, looking down at the heavy clay-stained sack resting on his threshold. No names are spoken, no pleasantries are exchanged. There is absolutely no conversation in this doorway. The graves were closed for the living's peace, and opening them is a terrible, violent felony. Both sides of the door know this perfectly well. Silence is the only safety. The porter nudges the heavy sack with the toe of his polished leather boot, simply verifying its terrible bulk. He nods once. You and the other man step forward, bending into the warm light just long enough to grab the canvas seams. You lift the heavy burden and slide it across the threshold, pushing it over the clean stone step and into the brightly lit hallway. The moment the sack crosses that line, a profound alchemy takes place. It ceases to be the stolen, sacred rest of a grieving family. It ceases to be the terrifying, heavy burden that you dragged through the freezing mud while hiding from the watchman's lantern. As it slides onto the polished floorboards of the anatomy school, it simply becomes anatomy. It becomes a subject. It becomes science. The porter reaches into the deep pocket of his apron. He extends a hand that has never held a short-handled wooden spade, a hand that has never bled against the sharp rust of a short-safe chain. You hold out your palm. He drops a small, heavy stack of coins into your waiting hand. The metal is smooth, perfectly round, and incredibly cold. It is silver. Guineas and crowns, the hard physical proof of the night's desperate mathematics. The weight of the coins is nothing compared to the immense crushing weight of the canvas sack, yet it is enough to buy another week of fire in the grate. It is enough to keep the workhouse door closed. You close your fingers tightly around the silver, burying your hand deep in the pocket of your heavy coat. You do not count it in the light. You simply nod. The porter steps back, and the heavy wooden door swings shut. The iron deadbolt slides firmly back into place with a definitive ringing click. The sliver of warm yellow light vanishes instantly, plunging the alleyway back into absolute starless black. The smell of the camphor and the heat is cut off, replaced once more by the biting, damp wind of the city. The transaction is complete. The burden has been passed. Tomorrow morning, the brilliant surgeon will stand in the bright theater, lecturing to 100 rapt students. He will speak eloquently of the nervous system and the intricate mechanics of the heart. He will not mention the freezing mud. He will not mention the broken coffin lid, the muffled wheels of the cart, or the desperate shivering men who stood in his alleyway. The entire institution is built upon a foundation of absolute denial. You turn away from the unmarked door and walk slowly back to the waiting empty cart. The exhaustion finally crashes over you, a heavy physical wave that bows your shoulders toward the wet stones. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the school pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling. The physical burden is finally gone, but the absence of it leaves a strange, hollow ache deep in your shoulders. As you step away from the unmarked side door of the anatomy school, the muscles in your back, which have been coiled tight as wire since you first dropped over the parish wall, suddenly begin to tremble with the release of the tension. You press your hands into the deep pockets of your damp wool coat.
In the right pocket, your rough fingertips find the smooth, freezing edges of the silver coins. The weight is negligible compared to the tremendous mass of the canvas sack, but in the brutal mathematics of the night, this silver is the only weight that matters. The cart rolls differently now. It is entirely empty, save for the stiff folded tarpaulin, the coiled hemp rope, and the short-handled wooden spade lying flat against the rough floorboards. Without the immense anchoring weight of the burden, the cart feels fragile. The single iron axle creaks faintly, a high, thin sound in the freezing mist. The muffled wheels continue their soft, wet glide over the paving stones, carrying you away from the clean, geometric streets of the medical district and back toward the sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of the city's forgotten edges. The fog rolling off the unseen river has deepened in the late, hollow hours of the morning, growing so incredibly thick that it ceases to be mere weather and becomes a physical presence. It is a heavy, blinding curtain of wet gray smoke that distorts every sense you have left. Sound does not travel, it is simply swallowed by the moisture in the air. The soft tear of the muffled wheels and the tired step of the horse are dampened to a phantom whisper. Even the shape of the cart itself begins to waver in the gloom, appearing less like a solid object of wood and iron and more like a ghost ship drifting untethered through a sea of gray water. You walk beside the cart, matching your exhausted pace to the slow, heavy rhythm of the horse. You do not walk alone, yet the isolation of the journey is absolute. The man walking just 10 feet ahead of you, holding the reins, is completely erased by the mist. Only his dark shoulders appear occasionally, bobbing in and out of the white void. You are moving as a crew, tethered to the same axle, yet you have never been more profoundly alone. Look at the shape moving through the freezing fog just across the cart from you. It is a man wrapped in a coat even more ruined than your own. The thick wool is entirely saturated with the freezing damp, heavy and black with moisture. The blue-gray clay of the churchyard is drying and cracking across the hardened leather of his boots. He walks with a pronounced uneven limp, favoring his left leg, his shoulders hunched inward against the biting wind that channels down the narrow alleyway.
From deep within his chest, a low, wet sound begins to build. He pulls a frayed, soot-stained scarf tightly over his mouth, trying desperately to stifle it, but the spasm cannot be contained. A heavy, rattling cough breaks the silence of the alley. It is a harsh, tearing sound, the unmistakable signature of lungs that have breathed in too much damp earth, too much freezing fog, and too much stale, ancient air from the bottoms of narrow, vertical shafts. The cough shakes his entire frame. He leans heavily against the wooden side panel of the rolling cart until the fit passes, spitting a dark, unseen measure of phlegm onto the wet cobblestones. He does not look up. He simply keeps walking. You do not ask if he is well. You do not offer a hand. In the daytime world, among honest laborers or men standing at a tavern bar, a sudden sickness might draw a word of sympathy or a shared drink. But here, in the suffocating silence of the night shift, it is entirely ignored. The men who walk beside you in the dark are not monsters. They are not the grinning, diabolical villains sketched in the cheap penny dreadfuls, or the legendary named criminals whose faces are printed on broadsheets to terrify the public. There is no grand malice in their tired eyes. There are no dark, overarching schemes being plotted in these alleyways. They are simply former sailors with ruined knees, weavers displaced by the heavy iron looms of the north, and desperate laborers who found the river frozen and the workhouse door open.
They are men who were ground down by the slow, crushing weight of the city until only the night was left to them. The silence between you is not born of anger, nor is it born of simple exhaustion. It is a rigid, unforgiving discipline. It is the core survival mechanic of the trade. You do not look at each other's faces. To make eye contact in this freezing alley is to acknowledge the shared guilt, to invite a memory that is far too dangerous to carry. You stare only at the wet cobblestones, at the cracked leather of the boots marching in front of you, or into the impenetrable blankness of the fog. You do not know the real name of the man with the cough. You do not know if the silent driver holding the leather reins has a wife waiting for him in a freezing garret room across the river. You do not know what parish they were born in, what honest trade they used to practice, or what specific, quiet tragedy forced them into the mud of the burial ground.
To know a name is to hold a liability. If the watchman's lantern ever catches you in the yard, if the heavy wooden truncheons fall, and if you find yourself chained to the cold stone walls of a parish holding cell, the constables will demand names. They will use hunger, the threat of the gallows, and the heavy iron rings in the wall to extract them. But a man cannot confess what he does not know. If you are entirely ignorant of the lives of the men beside you, you cannot betray them. Your silence protects them, and their silence protects you. It is a profound, devastating loneliness. You spend the darkest, most terrifying hours of your life working in absolute synchronized intimacy with these men. You rely on the strength of their hands to pull you from the collapsing mud. You trust them to hold the heavy hemp rope taut. You share the suffocating fear of the watchman's heavy tread. Yet you remain complete strangers, drifting like silent ghosts through the same fog, tethered together only by the short-handled spade and the silver coins in your pocket. The cart turns a final corner, slipping down a narrow, hidden passage that smells strongly of wet ashes and stale beer. The journey is nearing its end. Above the jagged, uneven roof lines of the terraced houses, the sky is beginning to change. It is not yet a sunrise. There is no warmth, no color, no golden light breaking the horizon. It is merely a slow, creeping dilution of the absolute blackness. The pitch black of the deep night is slowly bleeding into a heavy, bruised charcoal gray. To an honest man, this lightening of the sky brings relief. It is the promise of morning, of the waking city, of hot tea and a fresh fire. But to the hands in the dark, this pale gray edge is terrifying. It is the absolute end of the safe hours. It is the lifting of the protective veil. Once the sun breaks, the disguise of the shadows is entirely stripped away, and any man found wandering the streets with clay permanently packed into his fingernails and the smell of the grave on his coat will be stopped and questioned. The cart pulls into the small, hidden yard behind the shuttered tavern, returning to the exact spot where the night began. The driver pulls back gently on the reins. The exhausted horse comes to a final shivering halt, its head dropping low toward the frosted cobblestones. The disassembling of the shift is executed with the same silent, frantic efficiency as the digging of the shaft. The stiff canvas tarpaulin is folded tightly and hidden away. The short-handled wooden spade and the dark lantern are slipped beneath a loose pile of wet, rotting straw in the corner of the yard. The heavy hemp rope is coiled and secured. The silver coins have already been divided in the dark alley behind the anatomy school. There is no final reckoning to be made. There is no further business to conduct. The men begin to scatter. The man with the limp turns up the collar of his coat, melting instantly into the narrow gap between two brick buildings. The driver unhitches the horse, leading it silently toward a low, dark stable door. There is no handshake. There is no quiet word of parting. There is absolutely no morning greeting. In a trade that relies entirely on invisibility, to acknowledge another man in the growing light is to break the spell. You must all return to being nothing more than ordinary, invisible paupers before the city fully wakes. You watch the last of the men fade into the charcoal fog, leaving you entirely alone in the damp yard. You turn and begin the slow, heavy walk back to the boarding house. Your boots drag against the stones. The freezing mist clings to your eyelashes. The silver in your pocket feels suddenly heavy, a cold, hard anchor tying you to the violent reality of what you have just done. The dawn is coming, but it will bring you no warmth. You are simply one more shadow, retreating from the light, waiting for the safety of the dark to return. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the waking city pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.
The absolute blackness of the night is finally beginning to break, giving way to a heavy, bruised charcoal gray that seeps slowly over the uneven rooflines of the city. As you walk alone through the twisting, narrow streets, the freezing fog that has cloaked you for hours begins to lift slightly, retreating into the damp corners of the alleyways. The profound, suffocating tension that has gripped your chest since you first climbed the parish wall starts to unravel, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. Every muscle in your back aches with a dull, throbbing heat. The deep, biting cold of the winter air has settled permanently into the marrow of your bones, and your hands, shoved deep into the pockets of your heavy wool coat, are entirely numb. In this vast, unforgiving city, there is no grand redemption waiting for you at the end of the shift. There is no forgiveness for the heavy, silent work you have done, and there is no sudden elevation from the brutal poverty that forced your hands to the spade. The world remains exactly as cold and unyielding as it was when you woke. But in the quiet, fading hours between the dark and the dawn, there is a different kind of salvation to be found. It does not come in the form of a pardon. It comes in the form of 3 small, physical mercies. The first mercy is a sudden, stolen warmth. You turn a corner onto a slightly wider street, the cobblestones slick with the freezing dew of the morning. A few blocks ahead, before the sun has even considered breaking the horizon, the city's honest laborers are already beginning to stir. Beneath the high brick building, set deep into the stone pavement of the street, is a heavy iron grate. It is the ventilation shaft for a large commercial bakery operating entirely underground in the sprawling cellars. As you approach the grate, the sharp, bitter smell of the freezing river and the wet soot is suddenly overwhelmed by the rich, heavy scent of baking bread. It is the smell of yeast, warm flour, and dry, burning timber. You stop. You step squarely onto the thick iron bars of the grate.
Instantly, a heavy, continuous current of intensely warm air rises up from the ovens below. It envelops you, pushing back against the freezing mist. The heat hits the saturated wool of your trousers, sinking into the freezing dampness that has clung to your legs all night. You stand perfectly still, bowing your head, closing your eyes, and letting the warm draft wash over your exhausted frame. For a few precious minutes, the agonizing cold is held at bay. The deep shivers that have racked your shoulders finally begin to subside. It is not a fire in a fine hearth. It is only the exhaust of another man's labor vented out into the freezing street,
But to a body that has spent the entire night pressed against the wet clay of a frozen grave, this simple updraft of heat is a profound, almost sacred comfort. You remain over the grate until the numbing ache in your fingers begins to fade into a sharp, prickling awareness. Then, reluctantly, you step away, back into the cold, carrying the ghost of that warmth with you down the street. The second mercy is the sustenance of the waking hour. A few streets closer to the river, huddled beneath the overhanging eaves of a shuttered warehouse, you find a solitary street vendor. It is an old woman wrapped in layers of dark, ragged shawls, standing over a small, glowing charcoal brazier. She is a salop vendor, catering to the very first desperate shifts of the morning, the crossing sweepers, the dock workers, and the night walkers retreating to their beds. On the brazier sits a large, battered tin pot, gently steaming in the freezing air. The smell is thick and earthy, a heavy brew made from dried orchid roots, milk, and coarse sugar. It is a poor man's tea, thick enough to sit heavily in an empty stomach. You approach the stall. Your hand leaves the deep pocket of your coat, bringing with it a single thin copper coin. You do not touch the heavy silver shillings you earned at the unmarked door of the anatomy school. Those are reserved for the landlord, for the survival of the coming week. This copper is the last remnant of yesterday, saved entirely for this moment. You slide the coin across the damp wooden board of the stall. The woman does not look at your face. She does not look at the heavy blue-gray mud drying across the knuckles of your hands or the stains on the knees of your trousers. She simply takes the coin and hands you a battered tin mug filled to the brim with the hot, sweet salop, along with a thick, dense heel of day-old bread.
The tin mug is incredibly hot, burning delightfully against your raw palms. You hold it with both hands, lifting it to your mouth. The liquid is intensely sweet and scaldingly warm, cutting through the stale graveyard taste that has coated your throat for hours. It hits your stomach like a small furnace, radiating a heavy, settling heat outward. You tear a piece of the dense bread with your teeth. It is tough, requiring effort to chew, but it is real, solid food. As you stand in the shadow of the warehouse, drinking the hot salop, another figure emerges from the gray fog. It is a young boy, barely old enough to carry a broom, dressed in clothes too thin for the winter air. He stops a few feet away, staring with hollow, hungry eyes at the steaming pot on the brazier. He has no copper coin to slide across the wood. You do not speak to him. You do not offer a grand gesture of charity. But as you finish the hot drink, you break the remaining half of your dense bread. You place the tin mug back onto the wooden stall, and you leave the broken crust resting perfectly clean beside it. You turn and walk away, melting back into the mist. You do not look back to see the small hands take the bread. The transaction of survival in the deep city is always silent, but the quiet sharing of the crust is a tether to your own humanity. A small, stubborn defiance against the absolute brutality of the night you have just survived. The third and final mercy is the absolute release of the closed door. You navigate the final labyrinth of alleys, returning at last to the boarding house in St. Giles. The sky above the narrow street has turned a pale, watery gray. The sparrows are beginning to chatter in the frozen eaves. The night is officially over. You slip through the heavy back door, the hinges silent, and begin the slow, agonizing climb up the narrow wooden stairs. Every step requires a concentrated effort of will. Your legs are impossibly heavy, weighted down by the thick mud and the immense fatigue. You reach the door of your garret room.
You lift the iron latch, step inside, and push the heavy wood closed behind you. The sound of the latch clicking into place is the sound of absolute safety. The room is exactly as freezing and dark as you left it hours ago. The other men are already asleep, heavy, unmoving shapes beneath their ragged coats. You stand in the center of the cramped space and begin the slow process of shedding the night.
You unlace the thick, blunt leather boots, peeling them away from your damp socks. You leave them by the door, heavy with the undeniable evidence of the churchyard clay. You shrug off the thick, saturated wool coat, letting it fall to the floorboards. With it goes the smell of the damp earth, the heavy canvas sack, and the sharp camphor of the anatomy school threshold. You are stripping away the shadow, leaving the resurrection man on the floor and returning simply to yourself. You walk to the low bed in the corner. The thin mattress, stuffed with cheap, broken straw, looks like a sanctuary. You lie down, pulling the coarse wool blanket up to your chin. The moment your weight settles into the bed, a profound, heavy wave of relief washes over you. The solid floorboards beneath the mattress are a luxury. The stillness of the room is a blessing. Outside the single warped window, the sounds of the waking city begin to rise. The clatter of a milk cart, the distant shout of a street vendor, the heavy tread of honest boots on the cobblestones. To you, these sounds are a lullaby. The waking city means the sun is rising, and the daylight is the ultimate protection for the men of the dark. The watchmen are returning to their beds. The parish gates are being unlocked. The terrifying, vulnerable hours of the night have been successfully navigated, and you have survived. Your eyes pull shut. Your breathing slows, matching the quiet, heavy rhythm of the sleeping room. The ache in your shoulders begins to drift away, replaced by the deep, heavy pull of absolute rest. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere below, the waking street pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.
You sleep heavily through the short, pale hours of the winter daylight, but history does not stand still while you rest. Even in the deepest, most forgotten corners of the sprawling city, the heavy machinery of time eventually shifts. It does not happen with a sudden, violent crack. The end of the resurrection trade does not arrive in the form of a grand police raid sweeping through the narrow alleys, or a sudden moral awakening among the desperate men who pull the carts. It arrives exactly like a change in the deep winter weather, a slow, almost imperceptible drop in the temperature that begins far above your head, in rooms you will never see. The rumors start to drift down into the damp, smoke-stained corners of the taverns in St. Giles. You hear them spoken in low, hesitant voices over scratched wooden tables and watered gin. The men whisper that the wealthy surgeons are growing tired of the risk. The gentlemen of science no longer wish to deal with the mud, the midnight knocks, and the constant looming threat of the parish watch. The rumors say that the men in Parliament, sitting in their grand, warm halls, are finally drawing up papers. They speak of a new law, a sweeping mandate designed to completely restructure the business of death. The whispers suggest that the medical schools will soon be allowed to claim the bodies of the unclaimed poor directly from the union workhouses, the charity hospitals, and the debtors' prisons. They will legally harvest the destitute, entirely bypassing the freezing mud of the churchyard and the heavy iron of the mortsafe. To a man whose only wealth is the strength of his back and a short-handled wooden spade, the law is merely a distant rumbling storm. Paper in Parliament does not do the night's work. A debate in a brightly lit hall does not buy a heel of bread or a measure of coal for the small iron grate. For a few more hard seasons, the rope and the canvas remain firmly in your hands. The cart still rolls through the freezing fog, its wheels heavily muffled with damp rags. But the air of the city is undeniably changing. The demand is thinning. You feel it most acutely on a bitter, starless night in late November. The crew has assembled exactly as they always have. You have climbed the perimeter wall, navigated the dark geometry of the closed ground, and endured the suffocating terror of the narrow vertical shaft. You have hauled the heavy, shifting burden up from the clay, packed the earth back into the frost, and dragged the canvas sack through the sleeping streets. Your hands are raw. Your shoulders ache with that deep, familiar, throbbing heat.
The cart turns down the narrow mews behind the medical district, rolling silently toward the unmarked wooden door of the anatomy school. But as you approach the heavy stone foundation, the shadows of the alley remain absolute. You stop. The driver pulls back on the reins, and the horse halts in the freezing mist. Above the unmarked door, the wrought iron lamp is completely dark. There is no dull red glow piercing the fog. There is no quiet burning signal that the house is willing to buy. The door is simply a slab of dead wood set into cold stone. The driver steps down from the cart anyway. Desperation overrides the discipline of the trade. He walks to the door and raps his gloved knuckles against the heavy oak. 2 dull thuds, a pause, and a third. The quiet rhythm of the midnight commerce. You wait in the freezing damp, your breath pluming in thick white clouds. The wind howls softly at the end of the alley. There is no sound of a heavy iron deadbolt sliding back. There is no sliver of warm yellow light spilling out onto the wet paving stones. The smell of camphor and strong carbolic acid remains locked tightly away inside. The driver knocks again, slightly harder this time. Finally, a small barred viewing window at the top of the door slides open just a fraction of an inch. You cannot see the face of the porter, only a shadow in the narrow gap. A voice, low and entirely devoid of sympathy, filters out into the cold air. "The tables are full. The law provides now. Take it away." The small wooden panel slides shut with a sharp, dismissive clack. The silence that follows is entirely crushing. It is the sound of the brutal mathematics of the night finally collapsing. The immense effort, the paralyzing fear of the watchman, the freezing mud packed beneath your fingernails, it has all been rendered entirely worthless. The surgeons have found a cleaner, legal path to their science, and they have cleanly severed the invisible tether that bound them to the desperate men in the alleyway. You are left standing in the freezing fog with a heavy canvas sack that is no longer a commodity. It is now only a terrible, dangerous liability. You cannot simply leave the burden on the clean stone steps of the medical school. You cannot abandon it in the street where the morning light will reveal it to the horrified city. You and the other men must lift the heavy canvas one more time, sliding it back into the cart. The retreat from the medical district is the longest, heaviest journey you have ever made. There is no silver in your pocket to anchor you. There is only the terrifying reality of what must be done. You do not return to the boarding house. The cart rolls slowly toward the river.
You find a dark, abandoned stretch of the embankment where the black water of the Thames laps quietly against the rotting wooden pilings. In the absolute silence of the deep night, you and the other men carry the canvas sack to the very edge of the water. You weigh the heavy fabric down with jagged pieces of broken cobblestone and rusted iron scrap found in the mud.
With a slow, synchronized heave, you push the burden out over the water. It falls with a heavy, rushing splash, sinking instantly beneath the black, freezing surface, swallowed entirely by the dark tide. It is a silent, unceremonious end to the immense labor of the night. That is the true death of the resurrection trade. It does not end with a bang. It ends with a quiet splash in the dark river and empty hands shoved deep into the pockets of a damp wool coat. Over the next few weeks, the quiet crews simply bleed away into the shadows. There are no final dramatic processions. There are no grand farewells spoken in the tavern. The men who walked beside you, the quiet, nameless hands in the dark, simply drift away. The man with the heavy, rattling cough stops coming to the yard, his fate entirely unknown. The driver sells the cart for scrap wood, and the tired horse is led away to the knacker's yard. You are left entirely alone in your freezing garret room. The tools of the midnight labor are laid down for the last time. The heavy canvas sack, permanently stiffened by the blue-gray clay of the parish grounds, is left completely forgotten in a corner of a damp cellar, slowly eaten away by creeping mold and river rats. The dark lantern, with its meticulously oiled tin shutter, is tossed into an alleyway where it rusts shut in the relentless winter rain. And the short-handled wooden spade, the smooth, heavy tool polished to a perfect dull shine by the sweat of 100 freezing shifts. On a night when the cold in the garret becomes entirely unbearable, you take the heavy iron crowbar and bring it down squarely against the center of the wooden handle. The wood splinters and snaps with a sharp, violent crack. You break the spade into smaller, jagged pieces, and you feed them, one by one, into the small iron grate. You strike a flint, and the wood catches fire. As the flames rise, illuminating the cramped, peeling walls of your room with a warm orange glow, the burning wood releases a heavy, complex scent. It smells of dried sap, but also of deep earth, old sweat, and the sharp, ancient air of the vertical shafts. You sit perfectly still, holding your freezing hands out to the small, flickering heat, watching the physical evidence of your shadow life turn completely to white ash. You must now fade back into the vast churning machinery of the daytime world. You will become a back to carry the coal, a pair of hands to lay the new brick, a sweeper of the crossing. Your past in the graveyard will be permanently buried beneath a strict, unforgiving silence. The city will absorb you, entirely erasing the memory of the freezing fog from your skin. You will spend the rest of your life walking past the high brick walls of the parish grounds in the daylight, an ordinary, honest laborer with nothing to hide. But deep down, you will always know the true weight of the clay. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the new law pretends the ground was always closed.
And that's what's so chilling.
Decades pass, folding quietly into a new century. The harsh, freezing winters of the era slowly bleed away, replaced by the relentless, marching rhythm of time. The vast, sprawling city above you continues to grow, constantly tearing itself down and rebuilding upon its own foundations. But down in the quiet, undisturbed corners of the old parish grounds, time settles over the closed earth like a heavy, permanent snowfall. The massive iron mortsafes that you once bypassed in the freezing dark, the terrible, heavy cages built to enforce the peace of the living, are left exactly where they were planted. They are no longer monuments to a desperate, paralyzing fear. They are merely strange, rusted curiosities from a forgotten age. Over the turning of countless seasons, the relentless autumn rains and the biting winter frosts go to work on the heavy metal. The thick iron chains corrode, flaking away into a fine red-brown dust that washes down into the soil. The intricate, heavy padlocks, once slick with freezing dew and entirely impenetrable to your hands, rust entirely solid. The internal tumblers fuse together into a single dead block of oxidized iron. The heavy granite anchoring stones, which would have required teams of draft horses to move, slowly begin to sink under their own tremendous weight. They tilt and bow, surrendering to the soft, settling earth of the graveyard. Creeping ivy and thick, damp moss climb the iron bars, wrapping the cages in a dense green shroud. Beneath the surface, the roots of the ancient yew trees stretch blindly through the blue-gray clay, slowly seeking out the empty voids and the collapsed vertical shafts, weaving the fractured earth back together until the scars of the wooden spade are completely erased. Today, the world above those old parish grounds is completely transformed. The twisting, muddy alleyways that once smelled of wet soot and old rain have been paved over with thick, smooth layers of black asphalt. The heavy, pewtery fog of the coal fires, the blinding gray mist that once provided your only protective cover from the watchman's lantern, has been entirely cleared from the air. The modern city operates on a completely different geometry. Beneath the steady, unblinking glare of electric street lamps and the bright, sterile floor-to-ceiling windows of modern supermarkets, the earth remains perfectly, peacefully still. The modern citizens walk directly over the old forgotten shafts without a single thought for the freezing mud. They carry their groceries and their brightly lit phones over the exact ground where you once stood paralyzed by the distant bark of a dog dragging a heavy canvas sack toward a muffled cart. The layers of the city have stacked, permanently burying the quiet terror of the trade under a blanket of concrete and absolute amnesia.
Yet the memory of the night's work is not entirely gone from the world. It survives, but it has been completely sanitized, stripped of its freezing damp and its desperate hunger. It lives on in the hushed, climate-controlled silence of a modern historical archive. If you were to walk into one of these quiet, brightly lit rooms today, you would leave the noise of the city behind heavy, soundproofed doors. The air inside the archive is perfectly regulated, smelling not of wet clay or carbolic acid, but only of dry paper, clean dust, and quiet preservation. There, resting safely beneath the thick glass of a display case, you would find the old surgeon's ledgers. An archivist in clean white cotton gloves might gently turn the heavy parchment pages. The neat, precise copperplate handwriting, once scratched out in the dead of night by a wealthy surgeon's quill, has faded over the centuries to a soft, warm sepia brown. When you look closely at those pages now, there is absolutely no mention of the freezing mud. There is no record of the watchman's heavy, terrifying step approaching the narrow alleyway, or the agonizing physical pain of holding your breath in the dark.
There is no taxonomy of the sheer, suffocating panic you felt when the wet ground fought back and the shaft began to violently collapse around your shoulders. There is only the date written in clean ink. There is a brief clinical description of a subject, and there is the exact accounting of the silver shillings paid. The brutal, physical reality of the dark has been entirely converted into clean historical data. The profound, glittering edifice of modern medical science, the intricate, flawless mapping of the nervous system, the precise understanding of the chambers of the heart, the grand taxonomies of human anatomy printed in bright, heavy textbooks was bought and paid for with stolen breath, broken coffin wood, and freezing hands. But the archive does not record the cold. It only records the transaction. The midnight labor is now nothing more than textbook fact, safely locked away under glass. It is here, in the safe, quiet space of the present, that we can finally step away from the heavy clay. You can let the image of the dark lantern entirely fade from your mind. The night's desperate labor is permanently finished, completely confined to the fragile pages of a book you never have to read again. As you lie in your own room, wrapped in the warmth and the absolute safety of the modern night, feel the last remnants of the historical tension fully leave your shoulders. Your jaw can unclench. Your hands are completely empty of any burden, and the coarse, burning friction of the thick hemp rope is gone from your palms.
The doors of your home are locked, and they are entirely secure. The modern city outside your window is governed by different rules, softer lights, and a true, undisturbed peace. There are no heavy carts rolling with muffled wheels through the streets tonight. There is no unlit side door waiting for a delivery. There are no desperate men standing in the shadows of the yard listening for the watch. There is only the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of your own breathing, a quiet, reliable metronome guiding you gently away from the waking world. Allow the history to settle deeply into the earth, right where it belongs. Let the iron mortsafes rust away into nothingness. Let the ledgers close. Allow your mind to drift away from the damp stone walls, the wet brick, and the freezing fog, sinking down into a deep, heavy, and uninterrupted rest. The day is entirely done. The long, dark shift of the 19th century is finally over. You are safe to sleep. The iron keeps its cold. You keep your breath. Somewhere above, the archive pretends the ground was always closed. And that's what's so chilling.